In his wonderful book Soldiers of the French Revolution, historian Alan Forrest lays out a case for why the average French soldier chose to fight. And he looks at the letters they wrote home to their loved ones to get an insight into the mentality of the typical French soldier. Most young men sent to the front line were illiterate, and even those who could read and write were not experienced letter writers, likely never having lived long enough to be separated from their family and home for an extended period of time. But what's remarkable, says Forrest, is just how varied and just how honest many of these accounts were. Many letters home tended to consist of formulas, interspersed with revolutionary platitudes. Long live the Republic, a health to the sans-culottes, glory to France, stuff like that. Others indicated the great hardships endured, or overstated the writer's role in a battle. Through them all, however, there is a strong revolutionary through-line. The French citizen soldier was genuinely convinced that their cause was the cause of liberty, of equality, of fraternity. Equal parts patriotism and revolutionary fire, they were willing and ready to die for France. A recruit named Jacques Leclerc from the Jura in southern France wrote home, "Either you will see me returned bathed in glory, or you will have a son who is a worthy citizen of France, who knows what it is to die for his country." On the same page is another recruit who proclaims his willingness to die in even more fiery terms. "I would rather die 100 times than concede an inch to our enemy. Our cause is just, and we shall defend it, as we've always done, to the last drop of blood." Forrest makes the point that this is not the kind of passion one might typically expect of a conscript. How much of this is regurgitation of Hébertiste and Jacobin propaganda? Honestly, most of it. The propaganda fed to the troops was direct. They had company newsletters which always told the soldiers what the convention wanted them to hear. They also repeated lies passed down to them by their officers, or deliberately lied about their own exploits. And though to at least some degree, what the soldiers wrote home might not fully represent their actual thoughts, it's one thing to profess a willingness to die for France, and quite another to be bleeding out in the mud, there was a good degree of organic revolutionary zeal in the citizen soldier. Certainly nothing that can be dismissed as mere propaganda from the Jacobin, because as we're about to see, a battered France is about to start winning. The armies of the French Republic will be reformed into the finest in Europe. We left the armies of the Republic in April, not long after Dumouriez's defeat at Neerwinden and his turning traitor. While the months immediately following this debacle proved to be incredibly tenuous. From April through to September, the French were fighting on the back foot, losing ground to resurgent coalition forces surging into France. These woes were compounded by the representatives on mission. It was policy for them to countermand and undermine the officers they supervised. This was done in order to prevent officers from developing a rapport, and thereby potentially defecting together or plotting against the revolution. Advancement through the ranks came only by appeasing the representatives, and if denouncing a fellow officer, accusing him of incivisme, got an ambitious young officer some advancement, then many were willing to take the plunge. This is what had happened to Biron, to Marseille, to Custine, and would now happen to Custine's successor, Jean-Nicolas Houchard. Houchard was an avowed revolutionary, though hewed a more moderate line. He was a common-born former cavalry officer. The revolution had burned through pretty well all of its remaining aristocratic officers. Well, to be more accurate, most had never joined the revolution and then defected, or been given what the sans-culottes like to call a Republican shave, a one-way trip to the guillotine. Only full-throated and sycophantic supplication to the Republic was acceptable in the eyes of the representatives on mission. Houchard was one such sycophant, and represented the culmination of a few months of revolutionary interference in the officer corps, one that was denuded of counter-revolutionary elements certainly, but which contained officers either politically reliable or competent, not both. Lower down in the ranks, lieutenants and captains mainly, there were plenty of reliable and competent officers. We're going to meet a few in a bit. But the senior officers tended to opt for reliability over competence. They loudly sang the praises of the revolution, and followed the orders of the Committee of Public Safety, all with one eye over their shoulder, and no idea how to achieve victory. For now, in April, Houchard was in charge of the Army of the Moselle, and operated in concert with Custine's Army of the North. These were just two of the 14 field armies the Republic sustained, numbering something like 700 to 750,000 soldiers, though I've seen numbers reported as high as 1.2 million. As we've seen, these soldiers came in two types: rock-ribbed veterans of the defunct Royal Army, and patriotic recruits, at first volunteers and now mostly conscripts. The division between these two types of soldier was not only a problem in a military sense. Is it really any surprise that the conscripts underperformed and the regular troops conducted themselves with a surety guaranteed by decades of experience? No, the real problem identified by the Committee of Public Safety was administrative in nature. The organisation of the volunteer battalions had been undertaken in haste, when the Republic was desperate for men. Proper terms of service, receipts for payment or lists of provisions had been secondary concerns. Getting warm bodies on the court had been the point. Now though, these administrative shortcomings were coming to bite the army in the arse. Volunteers were not properly integrated into the existing system of quartermasters who provisioned the irregular units. So accommodation, provisioning, recruiting and resupplying all had to be done on the fly by the officers, and the officers varied wildly in their levels of experience, or competency, or devotion. The excellent record-keeping of the Royal Army was gone. The committee had precious little idea how many men were under arms, what they needed, what they were owed. It was chaos. But what really set the committee over the edge was their inability to properly effect many of Carnot's reforms. How could they pass down orders or reforge battalions if the army's administration was in shambles? It's like trying to shape goo. With the example set by the efficiency of the regular troops and their administration, for a little while there was talk of throwing in the towel and disbanding the armée en masse, simply folding it into the regular army. But as always, political expedient overrode any military concern. The armée en masse, for all its faults, was a national army, popular both among the soldiers and the civilians who supported it. So it looked as though that would be that. The committee would leave the army unreformed, and the regulars and volunteers would remain separate. Well, that was until Dubois-Croncet returned with a novel middle ground option, called the amalgame, the amalgamation. Basically what he proposed was the integration of volunteer battalions and the regular battalions. This would have three big effects. Firstly, it would enhance the fighting capacity of the regular battalions, who would be reinforced with enthusiastic fresh troops. Secondly, the volunteer battalions would be properly integrated into the quartermaster system. They would lose their elected officers, but this was offset by their being reliably supplied and paid by experienced logisticians. Third and final was the so-called embrigadement. Battalion size would be uniform, made up of 20 companies. 2 battalions of volunteers and 1 battalion of regulars would then be formed into a single demi-brigade, or half-brigade. This would represent both less work for the pencil pushers in Paris and a punchier, harder-hitting force at the disposal of the generals. The committee aimed to field 196 demi-brigades, which would from now on form the smallest strategic unit deployed by the army. They would be accompanied by integrated companies of artillery, engineers, field ambulances, and cavalry for reconnaissance and screening. In other words, the demi-brigades were mini, self-sufficient armies. Other bits and bobs followed. All the troops would be paid the same, wear the same uniforms, obey the same officers, and march in the shadow of the same regimental colours. These reforms were greenlit by the committee in February, and it was expected that the armies would immediately begin to implement said reforms. But no dice. Winter was ending, spring was coming, and the French armies wanted to continue on the attack. Even as late as January of 1794, nearly a year after their ratification, General de Gommier, just the most recent commander of the Army of the Pyrenees, categorically refused to implement the amalgame or embrigadement, openly disobeying his representative on mission. Now eventually the reforms would be implemented over the objections of the generals. But in the short term, the generals did get away with such flagrant disloyalty because many in the convention believed that this middle ground solution was impractical right on the eve of campaign season. They echoed the claims of the generals that it would cause too much disruption for the armies to continue to fight effectively. And to be sure, the generals and politicians were almost certainly correct. It took months for the reforms to come into effect. Certainly they weren't even partially completed, as the army was taking its nasty beating from April through to June. In that time, Dubois-Croncet continued to draft reforms, setting his sights on promotion. Recent events had shown Dubois-Croncet, and indeed the rest of the Committee of Public Safety, that their officers were either loyal or competent. Loyal officers were generally elected by the men from among pre-approved lists, in which experience was second to civic virtue. Capable officers languished in obscurity, unpromoted and unrecognised. That, or they chafed under the heavy-handed restrictions imposed by the representatives on mission. Their every move was scrutinised and every decision reviewed, and this really pissed them off. And it was a shame too, because the French armies were developing a strong connection between their officers and men, infinitely stronger than anything aristocratic toffs enjoyed with peasant recruits, as was the case with literally all of France's enemies. So Dubois-Croncet had to balance the political expedient of loyalty with the military expedient of competency, and again he delivered a viable middle ground option. All senior officers, generals and chiefs of brigade, would be appointed by the Committee of Public Safety. Their principal metric for who got to be a leader was simple: could they be trusted? For lower down in the ranks, Dubois-Croncet was a little more innovative. Whenever a new appointment was available, the rank immediately below the vacancy would select 3 candidates from among themselves. Likewise, men from the same rank would select 3 of their own for the appointment. Of these 6 possible candidates, 1 would be selected. This was a good system. It made space for capable officers to receive a lateral promotion, which was fine, But the real benefit was that this system allowed talented officers to elect themselves for promotion and to rise through the ranks. Because these votes would obviously happen all the time, the promotion of, say, a lieutenant to the rank of captain would be out of the hands of the representatives on mission, who would focus almost exclusively on senior officers. That all being said, the old ways of direct promotion based on seniority was not done away with entirely. Remember, a chunk of the army were veterans of the Royal Army, in which seniority outshone any notion of ability. So for 1/3 of appointments, pure seniority would decide who got what job, a respectful nod to the old guard. That Dubois Conseil made this nod got him in some hot water with Robespierre. He hated that seniority would have any purchase in the army. In the aftermath of Dumouriez's betrayal, Robespierre had been among those who feared that officers were a politically dangerous class, that they had to be purged of counter-revolutionary elements. This is why the representatives on mission were installed, and why the tribunal were happy to try and execute officers who showed even a hint of disloyalty. Going even further, Robespierre encouraged the representatives on mission to undermine the cohesion of the officers, playing them off against each other, fostering mistrust where there should have been camaraderie. Also, Robespierre put dumbasses like Rossignol in charge of entire armies. But still, he recognized the benefits of Dubois Conseil's plan, particularly liking the idea of decentralized promotions from within the ranks, which was very popular. When the proposal was passed and enacted in June, Robespierre followed up with a thoroughgoing purge of the officer corps. This is why, for example, Custine was fed to the guillotine. Top-to-bottom purges produced by around mid-1793 an army that was fully integrated into the Committee of Public Safety's centralized decision-making apparatus. They could expect their orders to be followed to the letter. This even bled down to the lower ranks, where the unprofessional nature of the volunteer battalions was displaced by hard-edged professionalism. This was chiefly the work of the representatives on mission, who tolerated no bullshit on their watch. Saint-Just made frequent trips out to Flanders and cracked down hard on looting by the troops and dereliction of duty by the officers. In one instance, he had officers shot in front of their own men as an example. When combined with training and drilling, the conscripts were converted from raw recruits to disciplined professionals. The better part of this installation of discipline, however, was supply. By mid-1793, Carnot's levée en masse was really beginning to churn out the armaments, equipment and supplies needed to sustain the war effort. Two major weapon manufactories, Le Creusot and Charleville, had been nationalized by the convention, and were now turning out Danton's promised muskets and cannons. Paris too was producing thousands of weapons a day. 600 forges were established in the grounds of the Tuileries, Les Invalides and the Hotel Luxembourg. The raw metal required was melted down from statues and donations. In fact, entire villages and towns donated their spare metal, including big brass church bells. Many of these armaments were made to very fine specifications, streamlining resupply and repair. The scientists of France were busy too, supervising the production of gunpowder from Paris's 6,000 gunpowder manufactories. Robert Linday's Committee of Subsistence was also achieving remarkable results. Food production was way up, now that recruitment had slackened off as the front stabilized, but perhaps more importantly, as droughts came to an end. The Hola Blas was stuffed with grain for the first time in years, and even potatoes were stored in the Tuileries. To oversee this influx of food, Linday had over 5,000 full-time staff organizing the supply and storage of food. The corresponding benefit to the troops was enormous. They were, for the first time, well supplied and well fed, receiving their full rations of bread, veggies and wine. Discipline imposed upon the army was demanded of civilians too. They were, as per the levée en masse, drafted for the service of the nation. The Committee of Public Safety had all the power they needed to pull the levers of the economy to sustain the war effort. The Montagnard's sharp left turn into economic interventionism was vital in this endeavour. Where before, at the beginning of the war, private contractors and local suppliers couldn't meet demand or refused to take the assignat, now the committee could rely upon Linday's Committee of Subsistence. There were some problems, however. The maximum applied equally across France, which imposed restrictions upon quartermasters as they had to pay fixed prices. Pretty generally, the committee wanted the maximum respected, but some representatives on mission knowingly flaunted the law and allowed their quartermasters to take what they needed. This resulted in some representatives being countermanded, as happened to the representatives attached to the Army of the Rhone. Transportation was another major issue too. Wagons and cart animals had to be used by the army to get about, and this invariably strangled the local economies of regions where the armies were stationed. Spreading the armies out might have helped, but this flew in the face of strategic reality. The armies had to be concentrated in order to repel attacks. In the Pyrenees, for instance, up to 40,000 troops were stationed along the border, placing immense demand upon the 125,000 residents. And because, of course, to repel attacks the armies had to be stationed by the border, areas with large non-French populations bore the burden. So despite the committee's best efforts and their numerous military reforms, France's economy wasn't strong enough to bear the costs of maintaining, and especially supplying, such a massive army. If something didn't change soon, if the armies didn't start decisively winning battles, then the war was lost. The only question would be which would break first, the nation's will to fight or the economy. The only solution was to abandon the strategic defensive and return to the offensive, to launch multiple simultaneous counter-offensives that would strike deep into enemy land. These autumn counter-offensives would begin in September, starting in Flanders. The campaign for Flanders had been, as we've seen, a very back-and-forth affair. After Dumouriez's retreat, the Duke of Coburg had recaptured the Austrian Netherlands, ousting the French from the fortresses they had captured. However, Coburg's offensive force was reduced by losses and the need to maintain garrisons. Fortunately for him, the British had sent a force across the Channel to reinforce. The Duke of York had a small contingent of around 9,000 men with him. Together, York and Coburg defeated the last of the French in the Netherlands at the Battle of Famars on May 23rd. Not long afterwards, they were advancing across the frontier. French forces offered what resistance they could, but by mid-July, Valenciennes was invested. A veteran of Jemappes and a member of the old nobility, Jean Ferrand, led a tenacious defence. But his 9,000 men were undersupplied and bombarded day and night, no match for the coalition. An assault was launched on the 26th. Days later, on the 28th, Valenciennes fell. This obviously put Paris on emergency footing and sent the Committee of Public Safety into a frenzy, but was great news for the coalition. They followed up by taking the fortress at Condé. Victory seemed to be assured. Into the breach between Paris and the enemy stepped Jean-Nicolas Houchard, replacing Custine as commander of the Army of the North. With the need to return to an offensive footing made apparent, Houchard spied an opportunity to defeat his enemy in detail. The British and their Hanoverian allies had peeled away from the Austrians to besiege the coastal city of Dunkirk, as the Austrians themselves pushed towards Cambrai. York had the commander of the Hanoverians, Wilhelm von Freytag, take the British cavalry and the German infantry to continue the advance, while he laid siege to Dunkirk personally. York was in position around Dunkirk by August 24th, expecting to take the city eventually. Freytag, meanwhile, routed small French detachments and formed a loose defensive perimeter along a 21-mile front to screen York at Dunkirk. To their south, the Dutch under the Prince of Orange were forming their own protective line. With the Austrians laying siege to numerous southern forts, they were unable to offer much aid as Houchard advanced with the intent of relieving Dunkirk, and in so doing, driving a wedge between the Austrians and the Anglo-Hanoverians. On September 5th, he took up positions south of Dunkirk, facing Freytag's line. The next few days witnessed back-and-forth fighting between advancing columns of French infantry clashing with spread-out British and Hanoverian troops. By the 8th of September, both sides were exhausted, though the fighting was favouring the French. Reinforcements ended up playing the decisive role in the battle. Austrian reinforcements were too late to affect the outcome, and the Dutch weren't much chop in a pitched battle. Fresh troops from the Army of the Rhine joined with Houchard's hardened columns to launch a three-pronged attack centering on Hanoverian defences at Honderschut. The fighting was bitter and fierce, with plenty of tactical blunders from Houchard, but in the end, the determination of Jean-Baptiste Jourdan, a general de division, broke the Hanoverians. York's left flank was rendered dangerously exposed. Though the French weren't really in any condition to continue the attack, York still erred on the side of caution and abandoned the siege. Houchard, for his part, let York retreat unimpeded, only swooping in to take what guns and supplies had been left behind by the British. So despite the magnitude of the victory, Houchard was characterized by the representatives on mission in their reports to the committee as timid, having failed to deliver a killing blow when he had the chance. Houchard wasn't quite done yet though, even if he was on notice. A few days later, on September 12th, Houchard had reorganized his forces and shifted south to face the Duke of Orange's Dutch troops at the town of Menin. Attacking from the north and east, the Dutch were routed by the 13th. But by this time, the Austrians were wise to the threat posed by an army wedged between them and their allies to the north. So Coburg sent the bulk of his forces north, with General Beaulieu racing ahead with a corps of a few thousand solid troops. Beaulieu destroyed a French column on the 11th and followed up this victory by routing the exhausted French during a brief skirmish at Courtrai. Houchard felt compelled to retreat to his main base in Lille, and though the retreat was very well conducted, this was a fatal error for Houchard. His representatives on mission now had ample proof that he was both incompetent and ruinous. On September 24th he was arrested and immediately sent to Paris to face the Revolutionary Tribunal. He would be guillotined on November 17th, the third general of the Army of the North to be executed. Standout hero of the Battle of Honderschut, Jean-Baptiste Jourdan, was given the unenviable task of picking up the pieces of the Flanders campaign. But Jourdan was the right man for the job, a shining example of how a talented soldier could rise up the ranks of the Revolutionary Army. The son of a surgeon and orphaned by age 7, Jourdan had muddled about for his early years and eventually settled upon life in the army. He joined as an enlisted man and served under the Comte d'Estaing in the West Indies campaign. After the war had broken out, he rejoined the army, elected commander of a volunteer regiment. With the experienced officers in short supply, Jourdan was made a brigadier general and later a general de division. He led his division through thick and thin, earning respect for his personal bravery. He was actually shot in the chest at Hondershut, and for his capable leadership. This did not mean, however, that Jourdan was trusted out of sight. In fact, the situation in Flanders was so concerning to the committee that Lazare Carnot personally went to supervise the Army of the North. Almost immediately, he and Jourdan clashed. Carnot was a supremely talented administrator and organizer, less so a tactician or leader. Jourdan saw right through the bluster, but had little hope of out-influencing one of the top members of the Committee of Public Safety. And Carnot, for his part, mistrusted Jourdan, who was unenthusiastic about commanding over 100,000 troops, with his only prior experience having been to command a single division. Carnot made it plain that he was expected to carry out his duty, or become the army's fourth general sent to the guillotine. He also made it plain that the offensive had to be resumed. So Jourdan divided his command 3 ways, leaving most of his force behind to defend the border, while he took command of 45,000 men personally. His goal was to relieve the siege of Maubeuge, which had been besieged on September 29th. By October 1st, 20,000 Frenchmen were hemmed in by Coburg's army of 23,000, a mix of Austrian and Dutch troops led by the Prince of Orange. Another army of similar strength was kept in reserve to intercept any attempts at relief. That relief was on the way by October 3rd. Jourdan took 20,000 of his troops and rushed south, taking on reinforcements from the Army of the Moselle. On October 14th, his army numbered around 45,000 men again, and he had flanked around the east of Maubeuge. Initial reconnaissance conducted personally by Carnot indicated that the coalition was well entrenched. Indeed, Coburg was very sure that he would hold. The following day, on the 15th, the French launched their initial attacks. Jourdan's plan was to strike hard from the west and east simultaneously, and then launch a direct assault up the centre, from the south. Initially, things went well. On the west flank, the French broke the Austrian defenders at the village of Wattignies. On the east, things were less kinetic. Croats and French royalist troops held the village of Saint-Aubin for many hours until the Republican troops attacked under cover of their artillery. Watching the battle unfold from the centre, Jourdan and Carnot disagreed on what should come next. Jourdan wanted the flanking attacks to develop a bit further. Carnot thought they'd gone on long enough. Jourdan resisted as long as he could, but eventually he relented. Let it not be said that Jourdan wasn't brave. The central assault was likely to fail, but Jourdan led from the front. Murderous fire from the Krem Austrian troops left thousands of French dead and wounded. Afternoon counterattacks on the flanks ended the French chances of a breakthrough. The following day, Jourdan ignored Carnot's demands for an attack on the right flank, and instead focused exclusively on the left flank. This would be important for political reasons later on. Chasseurs held the Austrians in the centre, as massed artillery pounded away at the Austrian defenders of Wattignies. Really tough back-and-forth fighting ensued all day, with Jourdan once again leading from the front. By the afternoon, the French were close to breaking, but held out just long enough to capture Wattignies. As night fell, Coburg reassessed his position. Casualties were fairly light, but ammunition was running low. And sandwiched between the garrison of Maubeuge and Jourdan's force, Coburg made the decision to break the siege and withdraw while there was still a window of escape. On the 17th, he extricated his army with considerable tact. So Jourdan, despite having only taken a single strategic position after 2 days of hard fighting in which he lost something like 3,000 killed and wounded, had succeeded in relieving Maubeuge. Further French advances occurred throughout the remainder of October, in which they advanced across the frontier and re-entered Belgium. Despite heavy losses in getting this far, the Flanders campaign ended 1793 in a far better position for the French than the coalition could ever have expected. Tens of thousands of troops were across the border, and thus the burden of their upkeep was foisted upon the locals. Things further south weren't looking so good, though. Along the Rhine, the situation remained fairly stagnant, as both the French and the coalition had been forced to peel away their reserves to fight in Flanders. This limited the offensive capacity of both. Across the French Alps, the offensive was halted by the Piedmontese, and along the Pyrenees, the French were likewise in a pickle. Spanish forces had crossed the border in March, and spent the next few months turning back haphazard French counterattacks launched by the Army of the Pyrenees. But this cost the Spanish time in which the French reorganized. The Army of the Pyrenees was divided between an eastern and western division, with the eastern command given over to Louis-Charles de Flers. Flers was, as his name suggests, a former noble, but one of the few that remained loyal to France. That being so, he was suspected not only because of his origins, but also because he had surrendered Breda to the Austrians. Fortunately for Fleur, he was needed elsewhere and sent south to fight the Spanish. But the army he commanded was in poor shape, filled almost entirely with raw recruits and with precious few trained artillerymen. No surprise then, on May 19th, he was defeated at Masdieu. Soon after, the fortress at Bellegarde was invested and surrendered on June 24th. The loss of Bellegarde left the strong defences at Perpignan as the last best hope for the French to thwart the Spanish advance. Fleur had fortified the surrounding area and was able to defeat the Spanish columns attempting to envelop Perpignan. In spite of light casualties for both sides, the Spanish retreated south. In hot pursuit, Fleur got the worst of a day's skirmishing near the border. Hardly a knock on the man, but enough for his representatives on mission to swoop in and order him arrested. Fleur would spend over a year in jail, executed by guillotine on July 22, 1794. Even when Fleur was leading the army of the Eastern Pyrenees, Hilarion de Barbatante was the official leader of the army. When Fleur was arrested, Barbatante was now fully in charge. His first move was to make no moves, waiting around in Perpignan long enough for the Spanish to regroup and launch a second attack. Surrounded on all sides, Barbatante looked at the difficulties ahead and said, "Screw this, I'm out," and fled on September 18th. He was of course arrested, but despite the fact that the tribunal had an actual traitor general on their hands, they delayed his trial so long that Barbatante was let go. In the more immediate term, Jacques Gouget, a commander of volunteers, and Eustace Daoust, a staff officer, stepped into the breach and led the defence of Perpignan. Their personal animosity towards one another was put aside, and together they launched a surprise counterattack, routing the Spanish and capturing their guns. Subsequent French efforts, however, went poorly. Their counterattacks were defeated one by one over the next few months. Gouget was therefore transferred to the Army of the North, and would end up assassinated by his own men for launching a borderline suicidal attack. And Daoust was defeated in December, later arrested, and then guillotined on July 2, 1794. Needless to say, by year's end, the Spanish were holding on to only a narrow sliver of land on the French side of Roussillon. The Pyrenees campaign would resume for 1794, with the Spanish eyeing up the western approaches through Basque country. An offshoot of the Pyrenees campaign, or even the Alpine campaign, or hell its own thing, was a tricky business flaring up in Provence. The vital port of Toulon was occupied by the coalition. Toulon had descended into revolt against the convention after the purge of the Girondins in June. At the drop of a hat, moderate elements among the political class overthrew the Jacobin-aligned town council and declared in favour of the Girondins. But this was not merely a coup. As had occurred in another Mediterranean port, Marseille, the urban workers, especially the dock workers, were eager enlistees to the counter-revolution. A lack of affordable food was their primary concern. In a letter issued to the convention, one of the Toulon representatives said, "We want peace in our towns and bread for our families. A declining paper money and your terrible political squabble suggests we will receive neither." It wasn't long before royalist agents and remnant French royalists wormed their way into Toulon's revolt. The revolutionary authorities were quick to blockade Toulon from the land side, but were completely unable to prevent its resupply by sea. Though Toulon was home to the French Mediterranean fleet, numbering some 30 ships of the line, the navy was not as keen on the revolution as the army, and many ships defected or joined the Federalists. With Toulon left to fend for itself, it wasn't long before they were forced to plead for food. The British and Spanish fleets patrolling the waters outside of Toulon met with their representatives. The coalition's terms were simple. They would provide food, but only if the coalition was allowed to use the port and occupy the city. For a starving city, this wasn't a hard sell. The rebels threw open the port to the enemies of France. To meet this threat, the Committee of Public Safety had only one army nearby, a small army of a few thousand which had blockaded Toulon from the east. Despite capturing some fortified hills, they were too few to effectively lay siege to Toulon. So as fast as was practicable, the Army of the Alps was sent to retake the port. The Army of the Alps had spent the last few months ranging throughout Provence, defeating rebel armies and retaking French cities. They had started in Avignon and worked their way down to Marseille, which was retaken on August 25th, its surviving rebels fleeing to Toulon. And all the while the army was commanded by a general who was the very definition of politically reliable, but completely useless. Jean-François Cotteau was an artist by trade and had only joined the army in a moment of revolutionary passion. But he was truly sycophantic, and soon rose up the ranks to become, by 1793, a full general. Fortunately, Cotteau had a deep bench of talent, including a young Napoleon Bonaparte, who would render distinguished service in the months to come. In fact, as the army invested Toulon, it was Napoleon's efforts in scrounging every cannon he could that ensured eventual victory. He positioned his batteries beautifully, sighted the guns perfectly, reconnoitred enemy positions personally, and then risked life and limb in assaults upon fortified redoubts. But despite Napoleon's personal efforts, the siege was not going great. Carto had literally no idea how to take a fortified city, and blithely followed the orders from his representative on mission, one Augustin Robespierre, Maximilian's younger brother. This usually meant assaults against strong enemy defences, and though often successful, they demanded a heavy toll in blood. Napoleon had had enough of Carto's lack of a plan, and so devised his own. His plan was militarily brilliant, but lacked the benefit of rank behind it. Carto was not interested at all. This all changed when Carto was dismissed and replaced by another experienced dolt who was quickly replaced himself, making way for a seasoned general, Jacques-François Dugommier, to take charge. A fine leader, Dugommier saw the merits of Napoleon's plan and put it into action. Heavy, sustained bombardment from the French guns obliterated the Spanish and British ships docked in port. Fires broke out and pretty soon, the British were forced to either break out or run away. In a night attack on the 23rd of November, the British achieved initial success in their breakout, capturing an entire French redoubt and its numerous cannon. But a rapid counterattack, personally led by Napoleon and Dugommier, retook the position and forced the surrender of many British officers and men. With the breakout a failure, the French rebels in the town lost heart. Many voluntarily laid down their arms and surrendered to the Republicans. Not so for the remnant British or Spanish. They were ordered to hold as long as they could. Escape via ship would be a dangerous gamble. Toulon was finally taken after a massed assault in mid-December. Most of the British and Spanish escaped, but were forced to scuttle their own ships and magazines. This resulted in a series of truly massive explosions which racked the port. Fire engulfed everything. Some warships were recovered by the French, but ultimately Toulon was out of action for months. Paul Barras and Louis Fréron now arrived to deal with a rebellious city. Hundreds were massacred in town, a bloody coda to a bloody siege. The brutal suppression of the Federalist revolt in Toulon was just the most recent example of what happened when the Republic got its hands on rebels. Lyon was France's second city, located in Auvergne, surrounded by mountains and forest. It was also home to the largest silk and textile manufactories in Europe. Its political elite were those industrialists who owned the city's textile industry. They were both ideologically fairly conservative, but also very capitalistic. This brought them into general alignment with the more moderate elements of the early revolution, and they were generally quite supportive of the Constitution of 1791. But as the revolution wore on, and revolutionary politics took an anti-capitalist turn, the Lyon elite were all too willing to put a stop to the revolution. Even if they couched their decrees in terms of liberty and regional prerogatives, the underlying truth was that they felt their property, their land and their wealth was threatened. The fact that the Lyon elite was so entrenched caused the city no small amount of trouble. Throughout the revolutionary period, the city had been a battleground for competing factions. The more radical elements were led by local lawyer-turned-radical Joseph Chalier. Now Chalier was, to put it mildly, a bit of a nutjob, and his propulsion into the limelight as the leading Jacobin in Lyon definitely went to his head. He was supported by the usual array of sans-culottes, and if we were to put him on an axis, we might call him anti-capitalist and Republican. To his right were members of the political elite in Lyon, and they could be described as pro-capitalist and monarchist. Though the common people of Lyon did not like the elite, they were put off by Chalier's strident anti-clericalism and flocked into the arms of the monarchists. Indeed, even after the August insurrection, Lyon remained a hotbed of explicit monarchist sympathy. This Republican monarchist capitalist anti-capitalist battle culminated in the mayoral elections of November 1792. Chalier lost decisively, and though he would remain in the city as the Jacobins' eyes and ears, Lyon was all but lost to the convention. Chalier wouldn't quit though. But while he was a firebrand, truly committed to the cause, he was not a talented firebrand. A Robespierre, a Desmoulins, a Hibbert. A complete failure to read the room, and a firm push for anti-clericalism and extreme economic controls saw him lose support from both the lower and middle classes. Supporters from among his own Jacobin allies were then put off by political stunts. For instance, he had a stone from the Bastille brought to Lyon, where it was to be kissed by everyone in the crowd. Fellow Jacobins turned away, denuding Chalier's movement of its more moderate elements. There are no brakes on the crazy train. In early February, Chalier called a sectional assembly for Lyon and announced that he had a cunning plan. But before he could reveal the plan, Chalier demanded that all the sections take an oath of loyalty right then and there on pain of death. In the heat of the moment they complied, and then learned that Chalier intended to overthrow the Lyon town council. It was to be a bloody affair. In his own words, 900 bodies were needed for the country in danger, the bodies to be thrown into the Rhône. But this coup attempt was pathetic from beginning to end. The Lyon National Guard prevented anything untoward, and so Chalier simply declared victory. He formed his own insurrectionary town council, and then started to issue decrees, including orders for the disarmament of the National Guard. He did try to plead for support from Paris, but the convention was reluctant to intervene. Chalier's former Jacobin allies were instrumental in convincing the convention to steer well clear of this shitshow. Now, Chalier's council had no broad base of support and just kept issuing decrees wildly, calling for a sans-culotte army to replace the National Guard, the arrest of the rich, the arrest of all priests, just stuff that he had no power to enforce. The Girondins, who had won the mayoral elections by the way, eventually had had enough. National Guard arrested Chalier and his mates, throwing them all in jail. With Lyon now a Girondin city, they naturally didn't take kindly to the arrest of their compatriots in Paris. The arrest of June saw numerous cities and towns in the region declare in favour of the Girondins, and they all looked to Lyon for guidance. Bordeaux and Marseille joined Lyon in an alliance. Royalists now sprang up out of the woodwork and helped to form a Federalist army. Ousted Girondins congregated in Lyon and were in no mood to entertain the convention's attempts at achieving a compromise. Robert Lindet went south, hoping to prevent a civil war, but he was rebuffed. What's interesting to note about the Lyon Revolt, and indeed the general character of the Federalist movement, is that though it might be easy to lump it into the counter-revolution, it was not, in fact, explicitly anti-revolutionary. Remember, the Girondins are a revolutionary faction, and quite happy to wage war on the Austrians and spread France to its natural borders. What the Federalist Revolt did was meld the Girondins with the liberals who had been put off by the radical turn of revolutionary politics after the August insurrection. These were guys who applauded the Constitution of 1791 and who would have been perfectly happy to live under a king. This is what brought them into relative alignment with royalists and other counter-revolutionaries. Not political affinity, but a realization that they were trying to roll the clock back. The Federalists were a popular movement too, and even had their own version of the sans-culotte. Lyon in particular was home of the Moscadins, fairly well-off townspeople who worked in semi-skilled professions, so we're talking about servants, cooks, bakers, clerks and sometimes artisans. The appellation Moscadin had, just like sans-culotte, initially been applied derisively, and meant something like the perfumed, in reference to the heavy musk-inlaid scents popular among these young moderates. The rise of the Federalists and their Moscadin foot soldiers encouraged the convention to declare Lyon in rebellion in mid-July. They dispatched an army to retake the city. Ready for the hammer to fall, the Lyonnais blooded their guillotine. Chalier was executed on the 16th. Other local Jacobins were variously executed or assassinated. And the Moscadins had turned out in force, armed and ready for action, led and organised by an experienced royalist, General de Percy. Our old friend, François-Étienne Kellerman, of Valmy fame, was the general expected to pacify Lyon. So important was this task that an inner-circle Jacobin, Georges Couthon, was attached to Kellerman as the representative on mission. After the city was surrounded and cut off on September 29th, Couthon gave the defenders a chance to surrender. He was a very accommodating man by nature. Unfortunately, this leniency didn't pan out. Lyon wouldn't surrender, though to be sure, many royalists showed their true colours and fled while there was still a chance. A devastatingly accurate bombardment of Lyon followed. In short order, the city fell to the Republicans on October 9th. The immediate task was to disarm and arrest the thousands of Moscadins captured in Lyon. But what to do about political prisoners was a tougher question. Paris was well aware of this issue, and deeming Lyon's treason too important to let slide, they formed a commission to make an example of the city, which betrayed France in its hour of need. There had been talk about sparing Lyon. Bordeaux, itself recently recaptured, had simply been recaptured, and all but the Federalist ringleaders were spared. But Robespierre was adamant, quote, "The memory of Chalier must be avenged." Couthon was one of two representatives in Lyon, and despite his initial reservations, he followed the committee's orders with incredible zeal. Specifically, he followed Bertrand Barrere's orders to almost literally wipe Lyon off the map. Officially, this city was now referred to as the Liberated Town. Marseille, too, was renamed the Ville sans nom, the city without a name. The revolutionaries had a habit of symbolically renaming things in an effort to efface the past. The political prisoners were then guillotined, something like 30 in all. All the old surviving Jacobins were reinstated and given control of the city on October 12th. And then in late October, Couthon ordered the homes of Lyon's richest citizens to be demolished, finishing the job wrought by cannons during the siege. After an elaborate ceremony in which he was carried on the backs of sans-culottes, Couthon struck the walls with a silver mallet, signalling for the workers to begin the demolition. And the workers themselves were quite eager, relishing the idea of tearing down the houses of their landed oppressors. Couthon's rationale behind these demolitions was to destroy the livelihood of the city's elite, who he believed were to blame for Lyon's stubborn localism. His approach, however, was either too tepid or too extreme for the convention. Some noted with irony how Couthon was willing to execute the homes of traitors, but not the traitors themselves. Thus, he and his second were recalled by the beginning of November, replaced by another pair of representatives, Collot d'Herbois and Joseph Fouché. Herbois' tenure was to ensure his reputation as an agent of terror. He was an actor by trade and really quite vain. He was also a well-travelled man, if you recall, and had probably visited Lyon many times. On one such visit, his performance at the City Theatre was muddled through by an unenthusiastic audience. How much this personal slight informed his belief that none but Léon Sans-Culotte could be spared the guillotine is impossible to know. Needless to say, but Herbois left a lot of blood in his wake. To begin, the local revolutionary tribunal was given his new orders and told to really get the terror started. Cash incentives were offered to those citizens who would denounce counter-revolutionaries. With lists of names in hand, well-organised units of police went house to house, rounding up priests, merchants and rich citizens by the cartload. For these rich citizens, the tribunal demanded 30,000 livres as an immediate bail. Very few could pay. As November wore on into December, most of Lyon's truly dissentious population had been executed or forced to flee. But still the denunciations were coming thick and fast, with citizens accusing each other of various minor infractions that fell far short of true acts of counter-revolution. That didn't matter in the liberated town, however. Every citizen arrested for graffitiing, or pissing on a Liberty tree, or ever having been kind to a priest, was sent to the guillotine. We know from excellent record-keeping that people died in droves, sometimes several dozen in an hour. On the 4th of December, for example, 130 people were killed in a single day. And as was the case everywhere, citizens complained about the blood that accumulated during the executions, and so the tribunal obliged them by having less serious offenders shot outside the city limits, and then buried in mass graves. But even this was too slow. On the orders of Fouché, 60 condemned were blasted to pieces with close-range cannon fire. Eventually, over 300 would be dispatched in this manner. These final batches of killings finished off the last of the true Federalists, so that by the end of December, 1,955 people had been executed in or around Lyon. Like Herbois, Fouché had been instrumental in enacting the terror in Lyon. His talents ran deeper than that, however, and he was given a unique task suited to his background. The sickly Fouché trained in the Oratorian, first to become a teacher and then a priest. But Fouché was never going to become a priest, because his wide-ranging interests in natural sciences and Enlightenment philosophy instilled in him a strong aversion to the church. Even before the revolution, Fouché had been quite anti-clerical. As representative in Nevers, he had begun a program of de-Christianization, which had then been repeated in Paris, and which he would now implement in Lyon. I'll go into detail about this next time, but in short, Pierre Chaumette and Joseph Fouché will focus on eradicating Catholicism in France, while Robespierre and Saint-Just will unveil the infamous cult of the Supreme Being. In Lyon, all symbols of Christianity were removed from public buildings, and churches looted for valuables. Not only did this serve a symbolic purpose, but provided much-needed metal with which to forge weapons. Furthermore, any priests who were taking shelter among the peasants, or who had not taken the civic oath, were gobbled up by the tribunal. The fall of Lyon triggered a domino effect, in which the various major Federalist holdouts were isolated and destroyed. The exemplary violence visited upon Lyon, and later Toulon, were however just that, exemplary. The committee deemed it necessary to make an example of the city which had led the Federalist revolts, and the port which had welcomed the enemies of France. Other major cities received comparatively light punishment. In Marseille, for instance, over half of those sent before the Revolutionary Tribunal were acquitted. That being said, the devastation wrought was tremendous. Toulon, to this day, has never really recovered. Lyon went from an economic linchpin, the centre of France's expansive silk and textiles industry, to a burned-out husk. It was not until the reign of Emperor Napoleon I that Lyon would be rebuilt. Normandy too, you might recall, had been a hotbed of Federalist agitation. Well, to be brief, it turned out to be a grass fire. After the purge of the Girondins, Madame Roland had sent a letter warning her husband of orders for his arrest. She implored him to confer with his fellows and launch the regional revolt right away. Well, we know what happened next. Madame Roland got the chop, and Monsieur Roland did himself in on hearing the news. But even still, for a few weeks, the north was looking like it would be the second front of the Federalist revolts, with major cities like Rennes in Brittany and Caen in Normandy siding with Lyon. On June 15th, they issued a political manifesto espousing their aims, their intention to topple the, quote, conspiratorial commune that was the National Convention through use of force. To do this, they needed an army, and the prospects on that front were grim. It took weeks to organise a force of 2,500 volunteers, which looked okay on parade, but when put up against even weak Republican forces, well, let's say that at a skirmish at Brécourt, Federalist muskets were never fired but dropped once. Over the next few weeks, the Republicans chased the remnant Federalists towards the Pont of Saint-Malo in Brittany. It's here that Jean-Baptiste Carrier was sent north, on the coattails of the army. Wherever he went, Carrier left a light touch, content merely to re-establish revolutionary control and then quickly move on. Saint-Malo was to be a different case. Finally catching up to the army in Saint-Malo in early October, he found the port deserted, the Federalists having already fled. Blue-balled by not having been given a chance to exact revenge upon the treasonous Federalists, Carrier went into his next assignment as representative on mission to the Vendée with a score to settle. More on that next time. For now though, it suffices to say that the Federalists were a spent force, militarily and politically. Militarily, the showdown between the Convention and the Federalists had scarcely been a contest. The Republicans had regular troops backed by shiny new cannons, and blasted apart any Federalist forces daring enough to mount an actual defense. Those that did stand were reduced by siege, and as was the case with the Muscadins of Lyon, executed en masse. Politically, the Federalists had been broken by a combination of the carrot and the stick, a really big carrot and an even bigger stick. A soft touch saw reconcilable moderate elements rejoin the revolution, and allowed their peasant supporters to shift allegiance without feeling the need to resort to an insurgency. Where the stick came in was for everyone else, those that could not simply be brushed aside as mere collaborators, but rather enthusiastic leaders and supporters. The brutal crackdown in Lyon, and vicious acts of revolutionary terror therein, did have the suppressive effect intended. After Lyon, fewer and fewer Federalists were willing to poke their heads above the parapet. By year's end, their numbers had dwindled. The Committee of Public Safety viewed these acts of terror as action necessary to eradicate federalism. And it had worked. The Federalists will linger on for a while, but as an undercurrent, and certainly not as an opposing force capable of resisting the will of decision-makers in Paris. So with their hands untied, and resources that could be refocused elsewhere, the Committee's attentions would be refocused inwards once more. A return to their rational roots, if you will, because the Convention and the Committee will take another crack at rationalising France. And that meant more than anything a try at turning religion to revolutionary purpose.